anytime you see a function in math class, there's something that we need to assume. We need to figure out what the domain of that function is. So there's an idea called implied domain. So think about just those words for a second. Okay, domain. So we're talking about the x values of the function. And what does the word implied mean? It means it's assumed that you know. Alright, so here's the domain that you are assumed to know every time you look at a function. It's going to be, the domain will be all real numbers for which the expression is defined. Oh, okay, great. Well, when is a function not defined? That's really the question that we have to ask in order to understand implied domain. So our first type of function we're looking at is polynomials. In this case, f of x equals x squared minus 3x plus 8. Think back on everything you've ever learned, and are there any rules against plugging numbers into this function? Well, are we allowed to plug in positive numbers? Sure. Negatives? Yep. 0? Yeah, we can do that too. Fractions, decimals, anything you want, we could plug into this function and get a valid output. So for any polynomial, the implied domain is all real numbers. In interval notation, we would say every single number, so from negative infinity up to positive infinity. What about radicals? Here we have f of x equals the square root of 3x minus 8. Again, think back to your math knowledge. What are you not allowed to plug into a square root? Well, if we're restricting ourselves to real numbers, you can't take the square root of a negative. So we have to figure out, okay, what are the values that would turn this square root into or this 3x minus 8 into a negative number? So to figure out our domain, we start by saying 3x minus 8 has to be greater than 0. In other words, it has to be positive. Well, could it be equal to? The square root of 0 is 0. Okay, so that works. So 3x minus 8 has to be greater than or equal to 0. Let's solve it for x. Alright, so according to this inequality, as long as x is greater than or equal to 8/3, we're allowed to plug that number into this function. Well, let's see, 8/3, that's 2 2/3. So let's test it out. 3 is bigger. So if I plug in a 3 here, 3 times 3 is 9. 9 minus 8 is 1. Square root of 1, we're allowed to do that. So 3 would be in the domain. On the other hand, if I pick a number smaller than 2 2/3, let's see what happens. If I plug in 2, I get 6. 6 minus 8 is negative 2, square root of a negative number. Okay, now we're talking imaginary, so that is not allowed. What if I plug in 8/3? Alright, let's see, 8/3, 3's divide out, 8 minus 8 is 0. Okay, and we're good. So this is the domain, all real numbers greater than or equal to 8/3. In interval notation, 8/3 is the smallest number we could plug in. It's included, so it gets a bracket. And anything bigger than 8/3 up to infinity is allowed. Now you can write yourself a note here about how we came up with this little piece. Remember that you can't square root a negative number. You have to make sure that 3x minus 8 is positive or 0. And that was our purpose in what we did here. Alright, our next type of function for today, rationals, lovely fractions. What are you not allowed to do with a fraction? Well, we can't divide by 0. And other than that, there's no rules. Let's see, so in this one, we could plug in a 7. 7 minus 7 is 0, so that would be bad. But anything bigger than 7, anything smaller than 7, positives, negatives, fractions, decimals, you name it, you can plug it in here. So here, well, let's back up for a second. I know this one we could tell it was going to be 7 just by looking at it. But for future reference, what you're going to do is you're going to take your denominator, make it equal to 0, and solve the equation. And that's going to be the number that has to be excluded from the domain. So we said denominator equals 0. And that's how we got that. Okay, so our domain is all real numbers except 7. So that means our domain is broken into 2 pieces. So when we write our interval notation, we're going to have 2 intervals. So the first one, starting from the left, we're going to put all of our numbers less than 7, from negative infinity up to 7. This time 7 is not included because I'm not allowed to plug it in. So it gets a parenthesis. We skip it, and then we start again at 7 with a parenthesis because it's not included, and go all the way up to positive infinity. So there are 3 different types of functions and how you figure out the implied domain for each.